Thank you.
Thank you, Massimo. And yeah, go ahead.
I forgot to say the most important part of this is that you can buy the book at a discount, at a pretty significant 20% discount. The only thing you need to do is to pick up a card with a code from the table as you leave the room.
Thank you. The advertisement is part of the talk. Anyway, thank you, Massimo, and thank you also to Morgan Amons and the others here at CSTM for hosting me. This got rescheduled from the fall. I'm glad we were able to finally pull it off. So I'm going to be talking to you today about my new book, The Postgenomic Condition, Ethics, Justice, Knowledge After the Genome. And at one level, this is a book that is a history of the decade after the sequencing of the human genome and the effort to solve the problem of meaning created in the wake of that project. We sequenced those 3 billion nucleotides, and here you're looking at an image that is actually emblematic of the problem that I was looking at. Each one of those dots represents 50 nucleotides, and on the entire, you don't see all of them here, but on the entire image, there's 750 million pieces of data. And the way I got this image for the book is I went into the office, my office at the Genomics Institute, and my office mate had this image on his computer, and I said, "What is that? It's really beautiful." It looked like a waterfall, I thought. And he said, "That is a big problem of interpretation." I said, "Great, that should be the cover of my book." Anyway, so this is what they call next-gen sequencing. And I won't go into the details of that, although I could give you a half-an-hour talk just on that image. But when you look at it, it's like, well, what is that? How do we make sense of it? And what does it mean to live with a genome, more importantly? What problems of knowledge and justice do the sciences, health systems, and governments built from the material semiotic infrastructures of genomics present? So these are some of the central questions of the book. And one of the central arguments I make is that in the wake of the genome, scientists turn to liberal democratic principles to try and construct the meaning of genomics. So the chapters in the book each pick a liberal democratic concept. So you start with participation. We would begin in Tuskegee, Alabama, with the effort to create a human genome sequencing center there at the turn of the millennium. The argument being African Americans should be included in the genomics revolution. Moving on to representation, which is the chapter that I will be speaking from today. The idea that people themselves should be able to represent themselves genomically. Moving on to property with the personal genetic companies. Moving on to the people. In the case of the nation of Scotland, decided it was going to create a genomics of and for the people of Scotland. So you can see the progress through these different liberal democratic concepts. And the main argument I make in the book is that genomics is a medium in which we can see the limits of liberal democratic thinking for addressing the problems of knowledge and politics that we face in an age of digitized, high-tech, globalized objects like genomes. And I want to demonstrate that today through looking at one particular example, but I also want to today show you how you can take the framework of the postgenomic condition, which by the way is a riff on Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition and Lyotard's postmodern condition. Both of these thinkers were fundamentally concerned with the problems of meaning created by 20th century science and technology. For Hannah Arendt, it was, if you have read her preface to The Human Condition, she actually specifically cites the natural sciences and her concern that the natural sciences were rendering life into a symbolic language that was a kind of language that we didn't know the meaning of. and that it would be hard for us to speak about that which we do. I'll come back to Arendt in a minute. But she's worried about that problem in the 1950s. And then, of course, Lyotard with the big mainframe computers and the rise of automated thinking was at the concern of that report that Lyotard wrote in the 1970s. So, but today I want to use the analytic of the book to understand one central feature of living with after the genome, the struggle to figure out how to talk about genomic differences between humans. This is the David Reich. How many of you know about the David Reich op-ed in the New York Times, March 2018? No one knows. Okay. All right, a few people know. So in March of 2018, almost exactly 1 year ago today, David Wright writes an op-ed saying that the American public needs to get their head out of the sand and recognize that genomics shows that humans, that race is real, basically, at the genetic level. And then this response in BuzzFeed that I was an author on, these two pieces came out on the same day. Neither of us knew we used the term talk. But my argument in this talk is that instead of talk, we need speech. And here I'm drawing upon Arendt's distinction between talk and speech. And Arendt asks in The Human Condition, how do we think and speak about the things about which nevertheless we are able to do? For Arendt, talk was a one-way kind of propaganda, that which we try to use to fool a foe or convince someone to do something, whereas speech is sharing our stories across difficult differences as a necessary act of creating collective life. So it's about constituting the polity, about constituting the collective. How do we speak really about those difficult things that we need to speak in order to live together? So how do we think and speak about genomics? How do we think and speak about what genomic differences among human beings should and will mean for how we understand one another and live together? On March 23rd of this year, as I mentioned, these questions took on new urgency when the New York Times published an op-ed that argued that the American public needed to get their, quote, collective heads out of the sand and recognize there were, quote unquote, substantial biological differences between socially defined races. So for many who had believed the Times some years prior to this, the turn of the millennium, it was quite a shock. This is a time when a lot of articles were coming out saying, you know, the scientists are telling us that race is not biologically meaningful. How many of you heard about these articles? Scientifically speaking, race is not real. These articles were all over the place. How was it then that race was once again an object of genetic and genomics claims making? You know, had not the population geneticists, as Paul Gilroy claimed in Against Race, proven that there was no biological meaning to race? So Gilroy cites Luca Cavalli-Sforza, the population geneticist who was at Stanford before moving back to his native Italy, on the point that, and Cavalli-Sforza is the quote-unquote father of human population genetics. I'll get to him later, but he draws upon him to say that race is not biologically real. So in my presentation to you today, I attempt to provide the historical context needed to understand this puzzle and also the analytic needed. Why and how have we reached the disconcerting moment that not only threatens fragile but important relations between natural and social scientists, but also has created tension and discord within the fields of genetics and genomics? So this op-ed was a moment of much consternation, not only between natural and social scientists, but within the natural sciences themselves. To answer this question, I want to situate this historically. I mean, so this is me bringing to bear my first book on the work that I did in the second book and synthesizing it. And in that book, I start with these UNESCO statements. And actually, currently, I'm doing archival work at UNESCO, reading the over 1,000 letters that scientists sent themselves after World War II, when under the auspices of the United Nations, particularly the Education, Science, and Cultural Organization, they convened in Paris to try to write an expert statement on race. Then I will talk from that. I will include some of that work here in this talk. And then secondly, the International Hapmap Project, which is the subject of the third substantive chapter in the new book. And then finally, the Wright op-ed. And I'm periodizing this, looking at how we come to the same point, but through different prisms. Where in the 1950s UNESCO statement, science is the cultural resource that we're using to try to navigate these debates about race, and in response to Nazi ideology. And I'll come back to what I mean. But the idea was scientists could help us, and scientists could solve this problem. We needed truth to combat the ideology, and the scientists had the truth. Now, in 2002, with the International Hapmap Project, the scientists weren't saying we have the truth. They're saying we have a process that's democratic, and that's going to solve it. And this is in the context of the end of the Cold War and the rise of globalization. And finally, we have the New York Times Rykov editorial, and here Wright is really claiming the truth in that kind of classic transcendent way. And you must understand this, I think, in the context of the rise of the alt-right and the post-truth politics. So this is the periodization that I'm using to try to understand what is going on. So what remains the same in each of these cases, I argue, is a neat construction of the relationship between truth and ideology, genetics, and democracy. In each of the cases, either genetics or genomics, depending on where we are in history, was framed as a beacon of truth that liberal democratic societies could use to ward off the ravages of racial ideologies, or, as in the case of the Hapmap, the practices of liberal democratic societies were framed as a resource that genetics could use to ward off racial ideologies. Both narratives presumed a clear distinction between liberal democratic societies on the one hand and genomic sciences on the other. Each, genomics, democracy, could draw upon the other to shore up legitimacy and produce compelling narratives. So this is a kind of boundary drawing exercise that that tries to negotiate and solve the problem of racism in science. Genomics will nail the final nail, or will hammer the final nail in the coffin of racism, as Luca Cavalli-Sforza said. Democratization of genomics will lead to an unbiased anti-racist genomics, as in the case of the Hapmap. However, as we will see, in each case, these narratives disassembled, for on the ground, genetics and genomics did not, in practice, stand apart from liberal democratic practices, but rather reshape the very concepts that inform them. And I'm using this notion of inform. We talk about being in an age of information, and this would be my understanding of what that, we should really understand that as what it's about. Race, people, individual, participation, inclusion are all information being reshaped. And I would argue that failure to recognize these inextricable entanglements, these processes of mutual constitution, opened the door wide open to the return of race, but the return of race in a manner that scientists and political leaders alike could not account for or respond to, reproducing irresponsible science. Quite literally, science that one could not respond to. And irresponsible politics. Okay, so irresponsible science and politics is a result. Now, these are not trivial matters in an age bent on producing novel technologies for differentiating human beings and increasing anxieties about which human differences should matter and for what purposes. Just recently in Germany, the Bundestag in Bavaria has decided for the first time that the German government can use race, and through forensics. So they want to be able to go to a crime scene and not just match it to individuals, but be able to say, we predict that this is the DNA from X kind of person. That has been illegal in Germany, and for reasons, and race, which actually Rasse in German, has been taboo but that is breaking down now. And I've actually been involved in some of the struggles around that and responding to it. I want to conclude by reflecting how we might do better and produce responsible accounts of genomics and race. Okay, so to the first episode, these UNESCO statements on race, United Nations, United Science. So while W.E. Du Bois correctly predicted that the problem of this 20th century would be the problem of the color line, the problem of race represented itself as particularly acute following World War II. Nazi theories of racial hygiene had justified the slaughter of millions, and millions more perished on the battlefields fighting for, quote, the free world. And in the wake of these atrocities and devastation, many were asking, how are we going to put the world back together again in that immediate years after the end of World War II? Now, there were no clear answers. The Great and Terrible War delivered powerful blows to the credibility of nation states. The United States, the self-proclaimed leader of the free world, comprised its legitimacy through the subjection of millions, compromised its legitimacy through the subjection of millions of its citizens to subhuman treatment in the Jim Crow South and also the segregated North. So it's claiming to be the leader of the free world, but you know, this did not escape the Soviets and others. You were being hypocritical. And this was a big problem of credibility management after World War II. Now that's on the, you know, in the realm of political life amongst leaders of nations, but also many disciplines of science were tarnished. So physicists felt disillusioned. We have here Evelyn Keller's Secrets of Life, Secrets of Death, talking about how physicists left physics feeling as if their field had been partly responsible, largely responsible for the millions of deaths, obviously the ones due to the atomic bomb. How had so many become enrolled in the production of the most deadly weapon ever produced? The problem of how to know and live in the world presented formidable challenges in this moment. Now, while there were many differences of opinion, on one thing many agreed. The new institutions of governance and knowledge should not divide, but rather unite through the embrace of universal principles. So this is when you have the formation of the United Nations in January 1946. And the Declaration of Universal Human Rights that they put forward as the basis for the new polity. You know, we're no longer going to be citizens of nations. We're all going to be humans, and here's going to be our charter. And to support their effort, they argue that they commission the United Nations education, well, to implement the vision, the UN invested faith in the power of education, culture, and science, question mark. I don't know how many of you will know this, but to begin with, there was no S in UNESCO. It was UNESCO. It was simply UNESCO, the United Nations Organization for Educational and Cultural Reorganization. Just a half a year before the founding of the UN, the United States dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and for many, science was not an instrument of peace but war, and so therefore should not be included in the reconstruction. Yet at the end of the day, partially because of the insistence of Joseph Needham, pictured here. How many of you know him? Joseph Needham, okay, a few of you. Yeah, the enigmatic British biochemist and friend of the first Secretary General of UNESCO, Julian Huxley. How many of you know Huxley? A few, okay. So he persuaded him, and advocates for science prevailed. And then we had UNESCO, not UNESCO. And in December of 1946, the first General Assembly of UNESCO convened. Okay. And as one of the very first things that UNESCO did, one of its very first celebrated actions was the production of the expert statements on race. The idea here is that as part of the UN's effort to write their Declaration of Human Rights, UNESCO, the UN Social and Economic Council assigned UNESCO the task of gathering and disseminating facts that could combat racial prejudice and provide the grounding for their claim that we're all humans. We're not divided into groups. So this is the scientific evidence for their new polity, for their new declaration of, and their new set of rights. The early leaders of the UN expressed faith in science to overcome discrimination and unify. Stated Huxley, science and the scientific way of thought is as yet the one human activity which is truly universal. Yet as UNESCO was about to discover, scientists did not speak with one unified expert voice. While the UNESCO statements on race issued in 1950, this is the first one, and which proclaimed, this first one, mankind is one, while it received positive press coverage in media outlets like the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune. This is all over the place. They did a massive media propaganda campaign here. They published tens of thousands of copies of this statement. This was a huge operation. Despite all this statement provoked passionate opposition from many physical anthropologists and geneticists. In the pages of the journal Man, which has since been retitled, but then was called Man, British anthropologists, as an anthropology journal, British anthropologists argued that the statement had irrationally disbarred mental and emotional traits from racial analysis and confused, quote, race as a biological fact from the, quote, concept of race as a social phenomenon. So the first statement says, you know, scientists, they don't use race to distinguish between humans, and they don't use meaningful human traits like, you know, intelligence to distinguish people. And the geneticists and the anthropologists are just said, what are you talking about? And this was quite disconcerting to UNESCO, brand new organization, claiming they just got some experts together, put all this money into putting this thing out, and now you've got these folks, not just in the Journal of Man, but in prominent newspapers in the United Kingdom, arguing this is basically communism, you know, rising up, and this is worse than Nazi ideology. This is not true. And worried that the criticism would undermine the credibility of the statement, within a few months, the poor Alfred Matrot, who at the time was the head of the social sciences department at UNESCO, who was a great diplomat. It's interesting reading all the letters. You can see how diplomacy works. He held it together through quite a lot of stuff here. He decides, okay, we're going to convene a second group of experts, this time comprised, we get rid of Levi Strauss and all the social scientists we had, and we're just going to have physical anthropologists and geneticists, okay? So, and they try to do all this remarketing where they claim the first statement is the social science statement, and it's about the social side of things, and this is going to be the real scientific expert statement on race. Okay, so they do this. They get these people together in Paris again. They write a statement. And Matrot, he's wisened up at this point. He doesn't just make a massive propaganda campaign and imprint tens of thousands of the statement. He first consults a bunch of other people, worried that the people he gathered in Paris might not be representative. So he sends it out to like 60 people to get comments. And he ultimately decides not to publish a standalone statement again, but rather a book that contained the statement along with 60 responses from scientists around the world. And as the historian Jenny Bangham, who's written a lovely article about about the children's book, which I'll get to in a minute, that came out of this, astutely put it, quote, the genre of the statement was unable to bear the weight of the diverse disciplinary and conceptual commitments of the many academic communities invested in race science. So no more statements, books. The effort left those involved distraught. Even the ever diplomatic Matrot expressed exasperation that no one had informed him when he was doing the first statement that there was such a diversity of views out there about race. The eminent American geneticist Leslie Clarence Dunn, pictured here, confided that the process had, quote, left him harassed and sick. Despite the bitter disagreements among scientists, UNESCO, however, persisted in its belief that scientific facts about race could be gathered and that public dissemination of these facts could help fight racism. As part of its continued efforts, its Department of Mass Communication decided to produce a children's picture book. The text of the first edition was written by Dunn and illustrated by the prominent American-born but Paris-based illustrator Jane Eakin. But once again, controversy ensued. The US State Department asked that the first edition of this children's book not circulate on the basis that it contained, quote, inaccurate and misleading information about the race problem in the United States. The second edition, everything goes through multiple editions here, attempted to respond to the critique by carefully stating that the book's conclusions did not bear upon the problem of race relations. So basically they had to say, we're not doing politics here, we're just doing science. Published under the name What is Race? Here it is, great book. Highly recommend. How many of you have seen this? Anybody? Oh, it's amazing. All right, What is Race? The second edition did, however, continue to present UNESCO's vision of science as a tool to fight racism. And it began with a quiz. Which of the following, race is a difficult word, which of the following would you call racist? Okay, so this is your chance. You write down your answers. We'll see how well you do later on in the talk, okay? Mediterraneans, race, no race. Aryans, race, no race. What do you guys think? Yay, nay? Aryans, yes, no? How many of you think yes? How many of you think no? How many of you have no idea? I mean, no one wants to say. Australians, take a look at the Australians. Yes or no? I mean, there's an answer here, according to them. What do you think they thought? Okay, well anyway, you'll see later. All right, there are answers. There's truth about this, okay? So finally, the book presents, throughout the book, the new science of genetics, represented through the pictorial form of the isotype. This was like a new kind of graphic representation. And even if you didn't understand English, you were supposed to be able to understand this new international language of the isotype. It was supposed to be designed to be universal in its reach. It's presented as a source of factual truths that undermine old racial thought. So, for example, the mixing of human beings means that there are no pure races. That's what this is supposed to tell you. No pure races. It's different from saying there's no races. And then we've got this one that's supposed to show us that intelligence is shaped by environment and there is no, quote, hereditary or biological reason for assuming that some races have less aptitude for learning. But still they hold open the fact that you could study the genetics of intelligence. And the book promises precise answers. Following the quiz is this explanation and instruction. Okay, now you can see your answers. Look down below. Okay, so Aryan was no. Australians, yes and no. They're the only yes and no one. But what I want to point you to, regardless of your answers, you don't have to tell me how you did. Read this paragraph afterwards. As you can see, the word race is a difficult one to use correctly, but because false ideas of race have caused so much human and social damage, it is important that we should be as precise about its meaning as possible. And this whole approach, precision, persists in each of the three periods. Finally, the book presents this precise approach to the study of human differences as a humane science. The very word genetics, what is race, explains, comes from the Greek word for genesis. The field of genetics was founded by this friendly monk, Gregor Mendel. It reveals that we all derive from a common ancestor, which, quote, could as well be Adam, the Hebrew word for man. So it's telling this humane story about how we're all one. We come from Adam. This is kindly monk fellow who started it, not the Nazis. Okay, this UNESCO humanistic reframing of both genetics and race powerfully shaped how generations learned about the meaning of race from a, quote, scientific perspective. Indeed, when I was in grad school, we read a whole bunch of things that told us that, it was this UNESCO statement on race that was the end of the history of race and science. How many of you read those? Nancy Stepan and others. This was the historiography of race and science. It ended with UNESCO statements. Outside the academy, the statements also circulated widely. They were cited in the Supreme Court cases that ultimately ended segregation of schools in the United States. They played a large role in rehabilitating genetics in the post-World War II era and positioning the field as an anti-racist force. Rather than a eugenicist Nazi, type of operation, you have the UNESCO represented genetics as an enlightened, the geneticist as an enlightened scientist who set apart from politics and saved society from its racist tendencies. These UNESCO representations helped to generate a new natural and moral order, one in which human genetics could continue after World War II. In this new order, genetics was not aligned with totalitarianism, but rather the new democratic global order. And this would be important to the genomic era. The UNESCO statements established that it was possible to construct a popular narrative that there was a unified, precise understanding of race, even as scientists themselves fought bitterly over its meaning. So if you use a kind of Bruno Latourian, what are they saying out in the public and what are they saying in the background? Out in the public, they're saying this banal thing, our research, well, this is what they all wanted to say, our research cannot be used to support racism. It shows there are no inferior, superior races. They all agreed that. But behind the scenes, they were bickering over all the rest of it. Human groups differ profoundly in their nature and capacity for intellectual and emotional development. That's Ronald Fisher. We shouldn't use any of science to say anything about race. So that does, kind of contradict the forward statement. But there's all this happening, but that's what they're front staging. Okay. It also set up a problem that would haunt genome scientists and geneticists for the decades to come. They could no longer speak about that which they nevertheless did in that Arendtian sense. All right, episode 2, the International Haplotype Map. We've moved from scientists know best to people know best. Now this comes from the book, this part comes from the book. It's based on over 30 interviews with people who were involved in the organization of the HapMap project, my involvement in a lot of the meetings and debates about this in the early 2000s. This was a big part of my life for several years. So it's all presented in the chapter in the book, but I'm going to take a little bit of it to here in this talk. So this problem, not being able to speak about what you do, would be brought into sharp relief 40 years later when studies of human genetic differences once again captured the international headlines. Now, the Human Genome Project had just launched, and to much fanfare and criticism. Some worried that it was going to destroy biology. Others argued that it was going to be the secret of life. But the people who thought it was going to destroy biology argued that, well, biology is concerned with diversity. And the Human Genome Project is sequencing only one human. It is anti-biological in that sense. It is against the spirit of biology. And so these population geneticists convinced NSF to give them money for the Human Genome Diversity Project. So I wrote a whole book about this. I actually was going to come to Berkeley to work on this project, by the way, the Human Genome Diversity Project. I was talking to you earlier about this. It's best that I didn't. But that's a whole other story, maybe off camera. So this project became known as the Vampire Project. I mean, no one wants to start their grad school career working on a vampire project. And it was accused of being more interested in sucking the blood of indigenous peoples than in their ongoing survival. This was a problem. And in the wake of this, people at NIH did not want to touch anything to do with diversity with a 10-foot pole. In fact, when I wrote to one of the program officers back in 1998 asking for an interview, she wrote back and said immediately and wrote, "Good morning, Jennifer. We at the NIH do not study human genomic diversity. We study human genomic variation." Those of you know boundary work? That is a classic example. At the same time this was happening, all these declarations against the Diversity Project, there's this. The bell curve was coming out. Folks at the Genome Project knew it was coming out. Basically, they were concerned that genomics would be sunk as a project before it even had gotten started by being cast as a racist project. Okay. So in the wake of this potential threat, scientists who studied human genomes set out to correct the record. Luca Cavalli-Sforza went to UNESCO and argued, no, you guys just misunderstood. We actually are countering, we're going to combat the scourge of racism. We're going to nail the final nail, or hammer the final nail into the concept of race. But what he never specified, in which I wrote a whole article to explain, is that he always meant the social concept of race was over. Not the notion of race that the scientists use, which is correct and precise. People always confuse this. There are multiple concepts of race, not one. That's what you need. It's part of the Rosetta Stone you need to interpret these debates. Okay, so, but yet, despite Cavalli-Sforza and many other people and actual cultural critics coming out and helping them out, like Paul Gilroy, a bunch of other folks were, again, like front stage, backstage, they were upset. And, Natalie Inger's writing New York Times, everyone's writing. But then some folks say, you know what, no. We do want to use race, and all this other stuff is political correctness. So you've got Risch and Burchard and others coming out and saying, no, we can use race to look at genetic differences. Genome scientists, it became clear, would not be able to calm anxieties about the racist potential of their research through arguing that race had no biological reality. As in the UNESCO statements, there just was no consensus that they could reach. So in the wake of these prominent disagreements, remarkably, some prominent scientists began to admit that their use of race actually lacked precision, that they were confused. All the talks I saw Francis Collins, head of the Human Genome Project, give at the turn of the millennium included this quote by Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, Harvard professor of history and African American studies. When we talk about the concept of race, most people believe they know it when they see it, but arrive at nothing short of confusion when pressed to define it. I was shocked to see Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham's work cited by Francis Collins, but there it was. Rather than a rational truth that would set people free from racial categories, Collins admitted that genome scientists too were perplexed. And quite distinct from the UNESCO scientist knows best position, Collins said, no, we don't, and we need social scientists' help to figure this out. And thus they put a lot of money into bringing on board social scientists. Now, rather than precision, these social scientists promised democracy. They offered the potential research subjects in the NIH's effort to study human genetic variation, what was called the International Haplotype Map Project's key roles in research design and regulation. They said, look, we're going to include you guys. This is going to be a democratized science. It's going to be the leading edge of democratic science. We're going to include you in the design and regulation of the research. You will decide what we say in those consent forms. You will decide whether you want to give samples and when and whether you want to withdraw them. And finally, and most significantly, you will decide how we are going to describe what your samples are. So in a meeting early on in the project, this was promised to communities. The communities themselves will ultimately decide the exact description or a label by which they wish samples from their population to be identified. However, rather than the intended effect of shifting power from scientists to communities, democratizing the research, this practice unwittingly shut down speech and opened the door to the irresponsible return of race. Now, how did this happen? Through, I argue, the return of the discourse of precision. That no one gave up on that idea, unfortunately. Although this is not something anybody would have claimed or perhaps even recognized, granting research subjects the right to represent themselves enabled scientists to claim a scientific space, precise space for their work, with what they viewed as the political task of representation safely allocated to communities. We're going to put the politics over here. It became possible for project organizers to imagine that what they engaged in was the precise and the scientific approach to naming populations. Indeed, precision in naming populations formed the central principle of this document, which was their guidelines for referring to populations in the project, in which they say, that second sentence, from a scientific standpoint, precision in describing the population from which the samples were collected is an essential component of sound study design. Now, project leaders actually say they got the idea from social scientists who had told them about inappropriate overgeneralizations. You know, you really shouldn't be referring to Africans or Europeans or Asians. They say they learn from their social scientists, you don't do this. However, and we can say that that is a good thing to learn, but however, the trope of precision in debates about how to categorize humans for biological research, of course, is old. It's not like this was new. And in fact, you know, scientists themselves have been claiming this for a long time. You know, as we just saw, you know, Leslie Clarence Dunn had this in his, and put it into the book, the children's book. I don't know what child would read this book, but anyway, 50 years later, HapMap organizers made a similar argument. Precise geographic labels would help prevent discriminatory use of data. So, Yoruba in Ibadan, Nigeria, not African. Okay, that's precision. And even better, YBD. That's really precise. Okay. So these were the things, there were things, of course, gained from this. So the scientists learned that the Yoruban do not exist, but the Yoruba do. And they became sensitized to the problem of generalizing. But there were also significant costs. The investment in a so-called precise and objective approach to naming rendered it impossible for HapMap scientists to discuss their representational practices, because no matter if they said they had given them over to communities, they still held on to them. They were necessary to science. Science without representation turns out to not be possible. I know that's a strong claim, we can debate it later, but I would argue that's true. Consider the following explanation one project organizer gave me of the problem the HapMap researchers faced when describing their subjects. Something that we always in the HapMap in this project had to be very careful about is that we are not studying Africa, obviously, because Africa is a very diverse place with lots of populations. And that is why we tried to be very careful when we talk about the sample we did collect, which was from the Yoruba, that this is for the Yoruba, right? And it's not even all the Yoruba. It is the 90 DNA samples from the Yoruba we had. According to this HapMap organizer, the 90 people sampled in Ibadan, Nigeria, only represented those 90 people. I kept going around the bend on this. You know, who do these people represent? And this came back to just these 90 people. Now, while I don't suggest that complete coherence is possible, I do contend there's no coherence to claim that the U.S. spent millions of dollars collecting, you know, samples from 90 people, just found something out about 90 people. They didn't do that. They provided support to sample these 90 people because they thought it would reveal something about the genetics of a larger group of human beings. And then the critical question was, how large of a group, what kind of a group? However, HapMap researchers found themselves in a bind, unable to speak about these central aspects of their research. In short, through drawing a line between science and politics, or the communities over here and the scientists over here, and rhetorically placing the power to name with the communities and not scientists, they backed themselves into a corner. They no longer were able to speak about that which they nevertheless did. The result was an irresponsible science. That is, a science they could not even respond to or speak about. While unable to openly speak about this, and I'm going to come back to the significance of speech in my conclusion, in practice, those who used HapMap data did answer the question about who those 90 people represented. So scientists freely talked that these were African populations. So they reverted back to Africa, even if you look in the methods section, they do quite religiously go back to, you know, telling you it's from, they use the criteria in the, you know, that they were supposed to, Yoruba in Ibadan, Nigeria, YBD, they do that, but not in the title. They revert back. When they're trying to tell you about the meaning of this, when they're trying to get at the meaning, they can't be precise. All right. So, Now, this paper is by no means unique. Far from precise, an interview with me, a HapMap organizer, explained that many genome scientists viewed the HapMap's recommended labels as politically correct, and in practice generalized their findings to much broader groups. Through drawing a distinction between reality and representation and rhetorically placing the power to name with the communities, they back themselves in a corner. Yeah, we've talked about that. Now, not only could the scientists not speak, their research subjects could not either. Of course, this was not supposed to happen. Project organizers precisely sought to give people the ability to speak about and name themselves. Yet in practice, a different reality emerged. So in one of these community engagements that actually happened in Italy, one of the person that oversaw this explained, the community was supposed to have input on the names, the labels. So the first time I came back, my community engagement coordinator told me, you know, they came up with these most amazingly creative names. Like what? Traditionally red, which was red for blood, red for wine, and red for left wing. I mean, they came up, we had a list of about 7 or 8 fascinating names. So I asked, well, why did they reject it? Too idiosyncratic. Nobody would know what they were. Yeah, and the scientists, they wanted some relationship to Europe. They wanted a geographic label. So, in interactions with project leaders in DC, it became clear that HapMap designated communities would not have the freedom to choose their own names. Instead, they would be constrained by what genome scientists found sensible. And in the end, none of their names were approved, but the only thing they could do is have their names written in both their native language and in English. So in sum, HapMap leaders' attempts to grant people powers to accurately define themselves, in effect, disempowered scientists and communities alike. Operating within a liberal framework that assumes people exist over here, and prior to any attempt to know them and govern them, and could be precisely known and named, as if, you know, God created them and then we just give them labels. They rendered illegible important questions by doing that. They rendered illegible important questions about the role scientific practices play in constituting people, whether or not they wanted to recognize it or not. This made the project susceptible to unwittingly reinscribing racial categories and to repeating an all too familiar pattern in which liberal practices of freedom, in this case self-determination, participate in unacknowledged constructions of race. And of course we have lots of good feminist theory on this point. I'm sort of taking the work that Joan Scott and Laura Stoller, the insights that they have had, and bringing it to this new realm of genomics. Okay. And I guess I'm extending it by saying it's not just people who are disempowered, but the scientists who presumably, you know, have more power are also disempowered by this. No one wins in this situation. Third episode. David Rykov op-ed. It is this felt disempowerment of not just people, but scientists that we must keep in mind if we are to understand this current moment, a moment marked by the Wright editorial. Under the heading, How Genetics is Changing Our Understanding of Race, Wright argued last March that genomics demonstrated, as I said, that race basically is real. If you look at genomics, there could be significant differences between us, between races at the genomic level, and they could correspond. This is what was new about Wright. Others had claimed this, but that there were meaningful differences, but he went to mental differences. So not just in diseases, but actually in cognition. And that was the real pushing out the boat moment for Wright. No one had wanted to touch that before, but he went there. And Reich recognized that he was going to make people feel uncomfortable, but his argument was basically, if you don't take it from me, you're going to get something much worse. And he was referring to Nicholas Wade's, 2014 book, in which Wade argued, that, citing Henry Harpington, that people of sub-Saharan African ancestry have no propensity to work because they did not go through the type of natural selection for hard work that the last thousands of years that some Eurasians did. So this is he's like, if you don't like me, you should go with me because there's this worse version over here. And mine is the truth, and this is the ideology. Okay, so you can make your choice. you should go with the truth. Now, I think you need to understand that Rykov is responding to the years of population geneticists feeling backed into a corner, unable to speak about that which they did. Remember, Wright would have been growing up as a scientist during the HapMap era, when they were basically being told, no, you can't use race, and you need to use these exact things, these labels. And on this point, I would argue he is correct, and I applaud his efforts to set the record straight. However, there remains a significant problem. Reich's truth remains an irresponsible one. That is, one that is unable to respond to the deeper problems. The trouble is this: he fails to take responsibility for his own ongoing role in the production of the confusion about what life scientists think about race. Wright produces the same straw figures of the scientists and of truth that produced the confusion in the first place. This whole the scientist knows best. I mean, he's going back to the UNESCO figure of scientist knows best. I don't know how many of you know the TV show Family Knows Best. This is my representation of scientists know best. Belief in these figures keep Wright from the very speech he purportedly desires. Consider this. If Reich wanted discussion, he got the opportunity for it on March 30th when BuzzFeed publishes this response signed by 67 natural and social scientists, which included me, in which we argue that Reich failed to understand the critiques of the use of race in genomics do not deny the existence of human genetic differences or variation, or even the value of understanding it. Rather, the critiques call us to recognize the political and social origins of the categories we use to understand that variation, and the ways in which categories always reveal and conceal. As a BuzzFeed response states, for example, sickle cell anemia is a meaningful biological trait. In the US, it is commonly and mistakenly identified as a black disease. In fact, while it does have a high prevalence in populations of people with West and Central African ancestry, it also has a high prevalence in populations from much of the Arabian Peninsula and parts of the Mediterranean and India. This is because the genetic variant that causes sickle cell is more prevalent in people descended from parts of the world with high incidence of malaria. Race has nothing to do with it. Now, when a BBC reporter asked Wright about the BuzzFeed response, he did not respond to the substance of the criticism. Instead, he mobilized the now 65-year-old figure of the geneticist as the truth warrior, a brave soul who saved civilization from racism and the muzzling of free speech associated with dictators. States Wright, I'm actually very pleased to be part of introducing this discussion. I think that scientists have been anxious about discussing differences among populations in public fora, even though all the work that we do is about differences among populations and learning about their history. The BBC reporter further explains that Reich stressed the need for, quote, scientists to take charge of the narrative, lest they hand the initiative to those with less benign intentions. Here and in the op-ed, Reich positions himself as a courageous hero who dares to speak the truth. This is also how he is being positioned in the German-speaking press. I was actually in Germany when this op-ed appeared and dealt with the fallout in Germany in real time. This is the piece that appeared in the Frankfurter Allgemeine. It's by Axel Meyer, he's an evolutionary biologist, and in the Neue Zürcher Zeitung by Markus Schaar. Both of these scientists write pieces saying, finally, we have an esteemed scientist telling us what we always knew, which is that race is real and we should be able to talk about it and stop this taboo, which is just a bunch of political correctness. And this is all happening in the context of the immigration crisis in Europe. But this is a truth that is unable to respond to critique, and one that obscures the richer reality. As even my all too brief and selective history should make amply clear, Reich did not, as he claims, by any means introduce the discussion about race and genetics. The man needs to learn some history. In those prior discussions, while calling for precision, these geneticists failed to agree on the correct definition and approach to race. Not all population geneticists agreed with Wright's op-ed. Many of them weighed in on and helped to write the BuzzFeed piece. Many others are organizing their own responses. Reich, in short, does not speak about that which scientists nevertheless do. We must and can do better. We must resist the temptation to embrace the figure of the warrior of truth who fights the forces that threaten to shut down discussion. In an age of Donald Trump and the rise of the alt-right, it is tempting indeed to embrace the simple righteous narrative. Yet ironically, therein lies the beginnings of a new, more insidious form of silencing. We require, I would argue, instead new collectivities that gather diverse perspectives, not to engage in mere talk about race and genetics, despite the fact that I was an author on a piece that told us that we should talk about it in this way. You know, unbeknownst, as I said, we've had these same titles, but rather speech in the Arendtian sense. Enough of talk, let's speak to one another. Speech, Arendt argues, makes, quote, human togetherness possible. This speech differs from mere talk. The latter is instrumental, designed to fool a foe or dazzle with propaganda. The former is revelatory, designed to foster relationships and collective life. It requires the presence of others who are different from one another. And it is through speaking in the presence of others who are different from us that the common world forms. Speech in this sense is a form of articulation. It joins. For Arendt, speech also creates the grounds for judgment. It fosters thinking with others, what Arendt described, referring to Kant, a quote, enlarged way of thinking that is fundamental to judgment. And judging, she writes, is, quote, one of the most important activity in which this, quote, sharing with the world with others comes to pass. Thus, Arendt formulates her simple but powerful call at the beginning of the human condition. What I propose, therefore, is simple. It is nothing more than to think what we are doing. And for her, thinking and speaking really were not separate. Now, how to do this is far from a simple matter. I want to end with a few suggestions. I also want to say I recognize that there's a lot missing in the Arendt rendition of speech, but I think it's at least a helpful step to distinguish between talk and speech. But this has to be translated into an institutional form. What does this actually look like? What are we doing when we speak? Again, first we need to, resist the figure of the warrior of truth. It's tempting, but I think we need to resist it. And, second, we need to endeavor to actually speak to one another, but how? I want to give two examples. This is actually a group that Veronica Lipphardt in Germany has formed. It includes now population geneticists, epidemiologists, social scientists, historians, and anthropologists who have been responding to the Bundestag's putting forward of the legislation that we can use RASA now in our criminal justice work. And it goes through the population genetics problems with doing that. It goes through the societal and institutional problems with adopting this. The argument is, before you do this, we need to, the people implementing this need to be clear that it's not like you just go to a crime scene, you get the DNA, and you run it through a machine, and it tells you where the person is from. There's all kinds of confounding factors. Where are you getting your categories from? What's the history of this group of people? What kind of mixing has happened? What kinds of assumptions are you making in your modeling? It requires a village to create the critical understanding needed to even have the public debate about whether or not we should be implementing the use of RASA in forensics work. So this is one example of actual work. It's meant, when I was there, talking to journalists, being involved in the discussions internally about what we were going to say and how we were going to do it. How could population geneticists get their work done in the lab and still be doing this quote-unquote political work? What kind of credibility issues did they face doing that? These are the on-the-ground dilemmas of what speech means. Speech is not just get up and utter some words. Speech is negotiate credibility, authority, racism. It is a very complicated act. It is much more complicated than writing an op-ed in the New York Times. One of the things about Reich is that he's writing, but he's not in dialogue with anyone. I have not seen a debate with Reich. I have heard that his position is, if I have something to say, I'll write it down. This is a very particular notion of truth, in which truth is a one-way street in which it goes from the mind of someone who has the revelation onto the page and ends up in a book. That might be good for the Bible. I'm not sure it works for contemporary societies. And then finally, a plug for the Science and Justice Research Center, my own center, which has been trying to do this hard work. It is hard. It is hard to figure out how to redo a university so that we don't have our biologists over here, our historians over here. I will tell a short story. I did want to do grad school here, but I was told I wanted to do a master's in history and get a PhD in molecular biology. I was told it would not be possible. I hope it's a long haul, but we can and must do better than this. So I'll stop with that. Thank you.